So thanks for coming out. I know, especially for our students, it's not the best time of the year, and by burying ourselves in the basement here, maybe it wasn't the best location for the public to attend, but I think we've got a really good topic here.
They'll never know, will they?
Yeah, exactly. So our benefit, they'll miss those questions on the exam, and we'll go from there. Let me introduce you to Barbara Heim, who is an alum of Lycoming College, class of 97, if I remember correctly, and right?
Nice.
Yeah.
Flattery will get you there. Yes, 1983, before any of you were born, and even thought of.
I was born before then.
Okay, well, thank you.
But I know somebody in the room that was born that year. She comes to us for a couple different reasons. The timing here is because she's a member of the President's Leadership Council, of which I believe another guest here, we have Bob Schreibus, who is the president. Is that
Chairman.
the chairman? I'm sorry, higher than president. Yeah, right. Chairman of the President's Leadership Council, and I was a member where I got to know her through the energy stuff, the Center for Energy in the Future, and her interest and her background in that area, and now her membership on the Energy Working Group that's a part of the President's Leadership Council. When I knew that this meeting was going to be happening at this time, I said, well, it's not ideal for our students and maybe also not for our faculty, although they really don't have much to do right now. I said, oh.
If they weren't on sabbatical, right?
I said, hey, this would be a great opportunity to really tap into your expertise, because her expertise is in human resources within the energy industry. In particular, and off the top of my head, I should look at my notes, she was basically the head boss of human resources for BG Group, which was a major oil and gas company based, she was based in London until very recently when they were purchased and she got her stock options bought out and all of those fun things by Royal Dutch Shell, which if you've heard of Shell gas, you can figure out the Royal and the Dutch part of what they are. And so by human resources, of course, we're talking about people and their careers and their jobs. And I thought that was a fantastic opportunity for us to really understand from the perspective of somebody who's hired and helped people progress in their career, what that looks like, what the workforce and the diversity of opportunities look like within the oil and gas industry. And so I jumped on the opportunity to invite her to come up now from Houston and give us some perspective on those kind of things. As we've done over the talks over the symposium, we'll give her an opportunity to share her wisdom with us. Then she and I will sit down and connect the conversations that we've had now over the course of 5 events over the course of the semester by asking her some questions I've asked some others, asking her questions some others have now asked of her. Our last speaker asked you a question. You'll find out in a minute.
Okay.
And then we'll open it up to probably a wide-ranging and casual conversation given the size of the group. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Heim to Lycoming College.
I have to say, by far, that was the most interesting introduction I've ever had. So thank you, Jonathan. I know, and I am really a fly-off-the-cuff kind of speaker, but I started a new job 2 weeks ago, and I'm a procrastinator at heart. So I actually didn't start thinking about what I was going to say until Sunday night after a big Easter dinner, and so I'm going to use my notes quite more than I would normally do in the future. But I'm really glad that the 12 of you made it here, so thank you very much. And I want to start by just putting things in perspective. And we had a really fascinating conversation at dinner tonight about this. But it's my belief. So I grew up in a New York City suburb. And the biggest employers there were IBM and Reader's Digest. Actually, I'm from Pleasantville, New York, which is the home of the Reader's Digest, in case anybody didn't know that claim to fame. Kind of like Williamsport is home of Little League Baseball, so every town has that. But I didn't really know anything about oil and gas. And we just didn't have a lot of exposure to it, nor did a lot of our folks would go to school for engineering, but they would go more for mechanical. People didn't really go to be petroleum engineers. So it wasn't until 2001 when I accepted a position with Pennzoil. Hello, come in. I just started, so you haven't really missed anything. That's okay. Don't worry. I'm Barbara. Thanks for coming. But that was when I started understanding this whole upstream, downstream, and oh, by the way, all the internal competition between upstream and downstream. But the one thing that everyone agreed with at the time, and Pennzoil was much more of an automotive aftermarket consumer products. They didn't really like to call themselves an oil and gas company because they'd gotten rid of their refineries. We were trying to rebrand ourselves. But it didn't matter. In any of those types of comments, it was all about the price of oil. And that every day, the price of crude was what ruled our lives. But if you fast forward until 2009, when I went to work for BG Group, and that's where I spent the next 7 years. And those 7 years, in my opinion, now make me well qualified to speak to you on this topic today. Because actually, when I worked for Pennzoil, I worked in the Jiffy Lube side, which was very downstream. That was, actually, you could almost call that retail. But the company was oil and gas. But you don't really find many oil and gas folks speaking at liberal arts colleges, although Jonathan's had I guess I'm number 5. So there you go. But he's trying to single-handedly change the perception that liberal arts has a lot to do with potential careers in the industry. And a lot of people assume that if you don't have engineering or you don't have geology, then what would you do at an oil and gas? Well, believe it or not, an energy industry does not run on engineering alone. You know that saying, it takes a village? Well, that's the same thing that it takes in an energy. It takes what a large oil and gas company feels like its very own village. The industry requires a great deal of support, which translates into needing a wide variety of necessary skills. You may or may not be surprised at how much the industry relies quite heavily on experts in communications, safety and security experts, accountants, property and facility management, logistics, legal, information technology, and of course human resources, just to name a few. And I remember sponsoring a career day back at BG. What we used to do is we'd bring in kids between the age of 13 and 19. And a lot of them were employees' kids, but they were also, we used to say, if you have a child between the age of 13 and 19, if you know a child between the age of 13 and 19 and you want to bring them in, and they would spend a day, and it was really trying to get exposure to kids before they made their career choices going into school. So we spent all day teaching them about oil and gas, and we'd teach them about trading, we'd teach them about exploration. And at the end of the day, I would always come in to wrap it up. And so I said to them, I always ask the question, okay, so after today, how many of you want to come work for BG Group? And you get a couple that raise their hand. And I'd say, okay, does anyone have any questions? And this one little boy raised his hand, he goes, I want to work for BG Group. And I said, great. And he goes, but I want to be a chef. And I said, you know what? Actually, if you think about it, at our camps, because at that time we were building a huge LNG facility off the coast of Australia, so off the mainland on Gladstone, which is an island. And we were building this plant, and we had chefs because we had to feed the people that were at the camp, right? So I said, you know what? That can happen. So the point of it is sometimes you don't think about all the necessary jobs that really are there. So the typical ones that people always know that there's a finance arm and all that, but there really are truly, probably every single liberal arts major could find a job in an energy company. That's my opinion, if they want to. And there's really strong reasons to work for the industry, and specifically one of the larger firms. Equally, there are also what I would call downsides to working in there, and I think that people should be aware of. But I want to focus on the positives first. And the first positive is safety. Without a doubt, this is a dangerous industry. Men and women around the world have lost their lives or been significantly injured while performing their job. In fact, the 7 years that I was at BG Group, 6 people lost their lives. And safety is a huge priority for the industry, and they really do walk the talk. We instilled safety into all of our environments. Everything we did, we looked out for each other. We rely heavily on contractors and subcontractors. They had the same protocols. We would rely on them. We wanted to make sure that every single employee that came to work actually went home to their families healthy and alive. Sometimes, though, they could get a little bit ridiculous, safety things. For example, on an escalator, you were not allowed to walk up the escalator, and you had to hold your hand. Now, I'm kind of an efficiency person, and I'm thinking, I can walk and hold the side at the same time as the escalator. But if I did that, inevitably, people would come up and say, excuse me, Barbara, you need to stand still and hold the Escalator. Okay. But what you love about that is people really, I mean, they weren't afraid to tell you. They really cared. You know, we had cell phone rules before many of the states dictated it. You were not allowed to talk on the phone because distracted driving is very real. And I'm not a very good driver anyway. And I did find that, you know, since I'm not working for the company anymore, I do sometimes talk on the phone, and I'm really not as good a driver when I'm doing that. So, you know, instilling some of those safety things, it did make you feel like the company really did care about you, and that's a good feeling. The next positive is international. If you ever wanted to experience living in a foreign country, doing so while working for an energy company is a great way to do it. I am not suggesting that all the international locations we had are on everybody's bucket list. Some of them are in pretty grim spots. But working and living in those cultures, you get a perspective on life that really broadens, and the experiences that you have shape you for years to come. And quite frankly, these companies that sponsor you in these foreign locations, they ensure your safety, they provide financial incentives for doing it, and they just really give you the whole perspective. And it changes the way you think about life. You know, we get very insulated here in the United States, and it wasn't until I worked and lived overseas that I saw how unique people were. And it's interesting because in HR, what part of my job was to find out what motivates things. And if you think about, you know, my employees in Brazil versus my employees in Australia, my employees in Tanzania, employees in the UK, and America, they all were very different on what incentivized them and what made them proud to work there. Across the country or the world, though, everybody had that personal pride. And I thought that was kind of cool, and that was something that you find in most companies, but BG's, we were BG proud. We used to bleed orange. Those were our colors. Couldn't we pick a sexier color like blue? No, we were orange. We had orange everywhere. But it was a really pride. The next positive I have is diversity and inclusion. And no one will say that energy companies are on the forefront of diversity and inclusion. However, I would argue that nobody's working harder to try to change it. Energy companies are investing millions of dollars into schools to promote STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And they're doing this with young women and starting at an early age. That's not going to fix the problem tomorrow, but they're talking about the future, and that's what they're really trying to do. And I'm really proud of the work that we did within BG. Our senior management was very supportive. We had a lot of working groups that women could mentor other women, and they could, and it wasn't just, I don't want to suggest it was just a gender issue, because there were other groups that felt like they needed support systems, and we really stood behind that. And every large oil and gas company does the same thing. But we would provide a lot of professional development outside too. So there are a lot of organizations, especially in engineering for women, and that's where they would get, again, a lot of coaching and mentoring, and it makes you feel like you're not on an island and alone. Another big positive, in my opinion, is the fact that energy companies are good corporate citizens. Now, I know some environmentalists will disagree with me, but every large energy company has corporate responsibility values included in their mission. These companies are known for their generous philanthropy, primarily in locations where they do business. And in my opinion, the focus on the ways they protect the environment, improvements in the education system, and how successful they are garnering support for employee-led causes, they put their money where their mouth is. The impact is probably greatest when a company is going into a new country for the first time. For example, when we drilled off the coast of Tanzania, we were putting employees there, and we recognized that Tanzania did not have a very good healthcare system, nor an education system. And we invested thousands and thousands of, hundreds of thousands of dollars into improving their healthcare system. And yes, the benefit was if we had employees there, we wanted to make sure that they could be taken care of. But it was about growing, what's that cliche? If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for life, and that's what we were trying to do. Another positive working in this industry is technical training. And one thing you can count on is support for technical training. All the various disciplines of engineering were required to stay on the top of their game. And there are numerous professional associations of which we allowed everybody to be a member of. And the reason we did it, instead of having to come up with all the training our own, you had these professional organizations which were very powerful in teaching what the latest technology or what the latest news. And engineers speak engineer, so I don't know how many engineers that we have here, but they speak a different language. And so in those professional organizations, they could really aspire to be so much more than we could offer them, and we supported that at a very high level. Another positive, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, was established policies and procedures. The industry goes by standards, which are essentially, hey, Chip, it's okay, it's a small group, so yeah, so come on in, have a seat, glad to see you. Everyone knows Chip. But let's face it, the industry is very regulated, so you have to have really good policies and procedures. But there were policies and procedures for everything. So even from an employee-related, we had a recruitment standard. And those were really good, especially if you were new to the industry, because you didn't have to reinvent the wheel. You could just go find a standard, and then that showed you how to do something. The problem came in that the approval process to ever get them changed was a bit more challenging, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's really interesting because in our technical roles, we had one person per department that was in charge of the standards. And it was an honor. These guys walked around like, I'm in charge of all the standards. And I would sort of laugh because I just, how is that sexy? How is that fun? But they were so proud that because they took it so seriously that they had a book of standards. And boy, they knew it when you weren't following one. It was really, I mean, they aspired to be this head of standards. And one of the positives that I know everybody would have thought I would have talked about first is actually the pay and benefits. The industry really knows how to take care of their people. Now, it's my belief that some of it's because of the competition between oil and gas, and everybody wants to have the best. But I'm a realist, and I've worked in many different industries, and I worked in retail, where the labor line item for retail, that was the highest part of our P&L, was labor costs. In oil and gas, it's like so far below the line. So if we drill, I'll never forget, when I first got there, we had drilled a well in Canada. And it took us 6 months to drill that well, and it came out dry. And I said to somebody, I go, well, how much did that cost? And they go, $200 million. And I went, $200 million? And it's dry, and what happens? Yeah, we just move on. Well, the labor costs affiliated with that project were like 2%. So, I mean, it was a drop in the bucket. So that's one of the reasons that I do believe they can afford to pay those kind of costs, because the cost of just doing business is so much higher. Many of the pay and benefits programs in the past, though, were also geared toward tenure, so that the longer you stayed, the more your benefit increased. And it was quite a bit of golden handcuffs. And now with a lot of changes in pension laws and how things have gone, that's not quite as much, but that's what kept people in the same job for 30 and 35 years. And now with our millennial folks who don't stay anywhere very long, is that somewhat of ADD, but somewhat of, they had to change the rules to how do you keep people there. And there's other incentives now that will keep people there, as opposed to, if you stay another 5 years, then your pension costs or, your pension benefit is going to go up by 20% or something. But they still have phenomenal health and welfare as well as pension. And it's let's say it's a financially rewarding industry to be in. And the last one, which is also probably a surprise for a lot of people, is innovation. Oil and gas exploration has been around for a very long time. And sure, fracking is comparatively new to some of the offshore, but everything is being improved upon every day. The industry puts a lot of money into research and development because they always want to come up with a cheaper way, a faster way, a safer way. I always get surprised at how people think, oh, it's such an old, stodgy, and yes, it's not. You can't compare it to, Facebook and technology or consumer products even from an innovation standpoint. But they're innovative in their own right about developing new procedures that are better for the environment. And again, I know that sometimes that's debatable, but I've seen it firsthand inside, and they really try to do the right thing by coming up with methods that are going to improve upon and get us energy faster. So all that sounds good, right? Well, as I mentioned, there's also things that are not so good. And I would call them kind of like things of frustration. And my first one is policies and procedures. And I'm not contradicting myself. Everything was a standard. And that's all well and good, but I operate in a world of does it make sense? So a great example is we had a fleet of LNG ships. These are huge ships. And we had mega standards. Actually, we didn't own the ships, we contracted them. But we had tons of safety protocols that went with operating an LNG ship, which you have to. However, we had a tugboat that ferried people back and forth from the mainland of Australia to the island, Curtis Island. And the theory was, well, it's a ship, so you got to apply the same standards. And if you can't apply the standard, you have to file what's called a dispensation. We had over 50 dispensations. It's like, guys, just write a new standard. Oh, maybe. So it was very frustrating for me. Another example was how you extract coal seam gas, or even fracking shale gas, versus an offshore drill off the coast of Brazil. They're completely different. We waited until there were 165 dispensations waiting for an approval. And the approval process was somebody had to recognize what the difference was, highlight what the challenges was, prepare a paper on it, send that paper to a group that then discussed it, which then went to another approval process, which, I mean, literally, it would take months to try to get these standards changed. I was very frustrated with that, as you could tell. Another one, which along the same vein, is a presentation procedure. Because, again, I think it's such a regulated industry, and everything is so formal. So maybe some of you are familiar with this, but when I first joined, I wanted to get 30 minutes on the agenda for an executive meeting so that I could present a new way I wanted to do performance management. They said, okay, well, you need to submit a paper 3 weeks in advance. I go, huh? I just want to talk. I just want to do a PowerPoint presentation, show you what the rule, we'll have a conversation. No, that's not the way it worked. You had to write a paper, and for some reason, the paper had to be a minimum of 6 pages long, regardless if you had a lot to say or not. But it had to be 6 pages long, and it had to be in the structured format, and you had to submit it 3 weeks in advance, and then everybody would read the paper, and then you would go in and you talk about it. And oh, by the way, that's every oil and gas rights paper. So again, English classes are very important if you're going to work in the industry. Because some of these were full. Engineers are really smart, but they can't necessarily write to save their life. But as an executive team member, whether it was for an executive meeting or a board meeting, I had to read all these papers. And it was for the non-technical person, I was usually always the one that always asked the non-obvious questions, or at least they weren't obvious to me. The engineers would sit there and just look at me and go, yeah, Barbara, that's quite obvious. I go, well, it didn't make any sense to me when I read this paper. But it's just, I found that a very different way of doing business. Again, any other industry, consumer products, retail, you would just flash them with great graphs and pretty pictures, and everybody would just have a talk about it. They didn't need 3 weeks to prepare for it, but I understand, because the decisions that we were making were very serious, and they could affect the environment, they could affect people. So I do get that, and I'm not trying to take light of it. It was just, from my perspective, unusual and a little bit challenging on how much time we could have saved. And then there was always the bit about being in a non-technical role. So if you're a child of a family that has more than one child, do you have a competition about who's the favorite? So a little bit of story. We're in the Heim Science Building, right? So my last name is Heim. When I first came back to college and this was built, actually it was 4 years ago, I had a picture taken and I sent it to my 3 brothers. I said, well, guess who was the favorite? Mom and Dad named a building after me. Of course, it's no relation whatsoever, but I'll be darned if I'm not going to lay claim to it. And my older brother still believes that somehow this building is named after me. But in the oil and gas industry, technical roles are what's important. And frankly, we coveted them, and we did everything we could to make sure they weren't going to leave. if you lost a finance person or you lost an HR person, the theory was, oh, that's too bad, but there's a lot more of them. And some of that's probably true, but we tried very hard to try to even the playing field. But we did things like that were very overt. So our technical, in a compensation philosophy, we would benchmark our technical roles at a higher percentile than our non-technical roles. We developed a career ladder for technical roles versus non-technical roles. So it was just, you do those kinds of things because that's what the industry needs. The industry needs to have their technical people, which are your engineers, and you want to keep the best. So maybe you're not the favorite child, but we tried to make sure that we loved everybody equally, just in different ways. And then kind of a theme as I've been talking is I would call it patience is a virtue. Nothing moves very fast. At times it's highly appropriate because of the very important decisions that you're making. But decision making was a lengthy process. And there was I lived in the UK for many years. There was a lengthy process. And you had to follow the process about how decisions were changed. And only certain people could make decisions, which I thought was somewhat shocking, because we hired so many really bright, smart people. Why can't everybody make decisions? But it was very hierarchical, which leads me into another point of frustration was leadership. Just because someone is the best engineer and they're the smartest engineer, that doesn't make them a good leader of other engineers. And the trouble with the industry for many years is because we coveted those technical roles so much and we put so much emphasis on that technical training, they didn't have any soft skills. And it really took a long time, in my opinion, far too long, for the industry to finally realize that actually those soft skills were just as important. And really in the past 5 or 6 years, we spent a ton of time and effort into helping people. And it's not for everyone. A lot of engineers would come to us and say, I want to get a promotion, but don't make me manage people. Okay, well, that's sort of how you get a promotion. So, but they didn't understand that. They said, yeah, but I can be even better at my field. I can, so we created this thing called fellows, which is in academia, it's quite popular, right? And that's where we stole it from, because copying is the highest form of flattery, and somebody already figured it out. Why not use that? And that's what we did, is we created fellows, which were people, please don't ever supervise people. Just stay in your technical role and we will reward you. Because the higher you went and the more people that you managed, you got more financial rewards. And that's what they were looking for, but it would have been a scary thought if they ever led something. So there was a lot of emphasis in recent years, and that again is in all the energy companies are putting on developing some of those soft skills. It's not just pure technical anymore. You have to develop those others. And the final one that I would say is the downside is to work in a company or an industry that has so much cyclicality. And what I never understood is, in the course of my 32-year career, oil price was really low and oil price was really high. And then it went really low and then it went really high. And you think, don't they learn? They really did, because I've lived in Texas for most of those 32 years, a lot of them, and you'd watch, oh my gosh, hiring waves, the incentives that they were throwing out to pull people away from other jobs, and I mean it was just massive. All these people, phenomenal, and then the price would go down, and all these people get laid off, and you'd be like, I just don't understand it. I believe this most recent downturn, so 4 years ago, really. Companies have gotten smarter and they're building now, and we did this at BG, we built an operating model that was going to be able to withstand much of the cyclicality. Now, if it had gone 100 to 20, no, probably not. But if it had gone from 50 to 100, yeah, we could have sustained it. Because it was really about protecting your upside, if you will. So oil goes to 100, it doesn't mean all the gloves come off and you can buy everything you want. You got to have more discipline than that. And that was, I think it took too long for this industry to figure out what those answers are. So that's my upside, downside, roundabout comments about the industry. And now I'm going to have a conversation with Jonathan and I'm going to give him all of my inside scoop onto some of these questions that apparently, he told me that he'd prepared questions. I said, well, you didn't send them to me. He goes, yeah, I know, that's the point. So we'll see how this goes, and then we'll open it up for questions from y'all.
Well, thank you very much. You kind of set up a room assuming the middle is the middle, but they're all over there. So, Barb, we might have to get you to turn your chair slightly so more people see it, but there's the camera too. Well, okay. You don't want to see me at all.
Well, I didn't. Did he not just do I follow instructions? He told me to turn my chair.
Fine. All right, so one of the things that we talked about when we were contemplating these bringing in speakers is, you bring in a speaker, you say, hey, what do you want to talk about? These are the things we're talking about, talk and we'll learn. And they're always interesting, but you kind of wish you could have the first speaker talk to the last speaker because they disagree with things or they have different perspectives on the same things.
Well, everyone has opinions.
And everybody has opinions. And sometimes you really love the first and the last speaker to talk to each other, but it's dangerous to put them in the same room. So
bring it on.
Yeah. So that wasn't true in your case, I don't think. But what we thought is, well, how can we engage our speakers in a conversation with each other over time? And I haven't told the other speakers directly my model for this, but a lot of people in the room would know this. You ever watch Inside the Actor's Studio? Yeah. So they sit down after the guy's done his stock speech, and they sit down, and the dorky professor guy, played by me, asks sort of a standard set of questions, and it's the students in the room who are really the beneficiaries because they see how the differences and the similarities across the, in that case, various actors are to the questions. And so I have 3 or 4, we'll see how many, 5, see how many we get through here.
These fine folks might have questions.
And then we'll open it up to them. By the way, one of the extra reasons for doing this is some people are very, very controversial, right? And so if you open it up too quickly to the audience, then you never get to some of the bigger things because somebody asks a question to make a point. And I don't think that's true of these people, but
well, Bob might do that.
Yeah, Bob might. So
just I know where you live, that's all.
They're kind of 3 categories well, 2 categories of questions. I'll start there. One is about the theme of the symposium all semester, this semester, which is our energy future. Right. And so you've seen it from the perspective of large oil and gas companies, also end-use consumers in oil and gas. But clearly we're in a time of transition, time of change. So what do you see from that perspective of what our energy future looks like? And I purposefully made that question vague because I want it to be based in your perspective.
So so I'll probably answer it like no one else has answered it, but I think it goes to my last point about the cyclicality and the operating model. I think energy companies have to get smarter at how they use their resources. And I think part of that is around the health of those companies because of the fact that, again, I've seen it from the inside and how much they invest in new technologies and research and development. And if they don't have the correct operating model to run their business, they can't do those investments. And I just, to me, it's kind of the health of they have to be better managed. They have to run better, which I think protects our future, is sort of the way I see it.
So what don't they know? What do they need to figure out to be able to accomplish that?
I think they have to have more discipline. I think they just, I think part of the problem is there's actually too much money floating around, right? So I think personally it's a problem when oil goes to $100 because they take their eye, everybody gets real excited and they start flying around in corporate jets and they, hello, carbon footprint, all these kinds of things. And I think they get lazy. And actually, when prices are lower, they pay much more attention to all of those pieces.
Okay. So a more moderated future would help them to be more effectively managed. Yes. This is a kind of an extension of that came from one of the kind of last thing I'm going to ask you is what's the question for the next person? And this came out from, it wasn't the last speaker, but it was one that I thought was really good and broadly based. Continuing in that line of discussion, what then is the game changer that changes everything, either to the benefit of that kind of outcome that you were just talking about, or that prevents that kind of outcome? What could occur that might lead the price of oil to crash or skyrocket, that could either lead to really good management or really bad management, given the perspective that you were just talking about?
Well, it's probably two things. One is lower for longer, right? So if oil price just stayed, which, it's actually been more stable for the last 2 years than it has been in several years. But I think too that it's the renewables piece. I think that the technology. So we were having an interesting discussion at dinner tonight about solar. And again, I'm an HR person. Okay, I do people, but the technology is such. As I understand it, it takes so much energy to make like the electric cars, right? It's something about 4 times. Don't quote me. Something that I read said that it takes 4 times as much energy to make a battery for the electric car. So up front, it's consuming a lot more, but it's the payoff in the longer run that the benefit is. So what I think is the future is really about finding more economical uses. So it's solar, it's wind. I think it's all of those things.
Does that?
Which is funny because I came from an oil and gas exploration company.
Does that then, essentially create competition across energy sources that then makes better management more necessary? Is that how you tie all of those ideas together?
Personally, I think there's room for everybody, and I think that partnerships are probably the answer.
Okay.
Because I do think you can't rely on just one because of environmental issues. And so I think that if we didn't compete against each other so much, if we actually just parlayed that all together.
Okay. The other area that I really wanted to focus on is around, your idea in terms of human resources and career paths, and connecting it back to Lycoming College, a liberal arts college, whose students we're asking to engage with the Center for Energy in the future, to prepare them to be, at very minimum, good citizens in a world in which energy will always be important, even if we're not sure which of those paths we might follow. But maybe also individuals looking to build careers somehow connected to energy, whether they're in fossil fuels or they're in renewables or somewhere else. What should students at a liberal arts college be doing to better prepare themselves to engage with energy, both as citizens and then as a potential career path?
Well, I think it's probably controversial answers, but so one, I think people have to be good consumers of energy. So I think people have to understand how energy works and what we do with it and how not to waste it. And I'm big into conservatism, and I believe in climate change and all those and I think we all have to be better consumers of energy. So that's that aspect. And then I would say that, it's not so much about going to work in an energy I loved it. My last 7 years were some of the greatest, and part of that is because I worked with some really awesome people. And to me, finding a career is about finding your niche. I was very lucky. I went to Lycoming College, and really I wanted to go work in pro football. Okay, I couldn't be farther from that, right? I wanted to do public relations for pro football. And I lucked into, I had a great mentor at the New York Giants when I did an internship with him, who said, actually, Barbara, you need to go work in human resources. I don't know if that meant I was a really bad PR person or he just knew that, but he saw that in me, and I had the next 30 years to thank him for it, because that's what I did. And it didn't matter what industry I was in. So I think it's more about what do you like to do? if political science is your deal, if environmental change is your deal, if finance is your deal, I mean, to me, it's more about finding your passion. Any of these companies have it. I mean, the benefit of oil and gas are those things that I talked about. I mean, if you want to work internationally, I mean, sure, consumer products companies are international. I'll tell you, they don't export Americans to other countries. The thing about oil and gas is we had probably 35% of our people at a time were expated somewhere. I mean, that's huge. And it's very costly, but the experience is, I mean, so if that, and when I talk to, I mean, I mentor quite a few people, and when they all say, oh, I want to go work in another country, and then I start talking about oil and gas, I go, yeah, but aren't they like in Africa? And, I'm like, okay, well, if you want to go live in Zurich, yeah, that's probably not an oil and gas company. Well, actually, there's trading there, but so that's maybe about it. But my point is, think about what your passion is, which I realize is off topic, Jonathan, but I don't think it's about energy. I mean, I think that you have to find what makes you tick, and sometimes you don't find that until you work in a couple of different places. But the thing about that I can't speak to enough about energy companies is they really put their money where their mouth is from a personal development standpoint. I mean, they typically have the money, right? So you're going to get training, you're going to get development, you're going to get opportunities. That's the thing about energy that I think is so great about working in those companies. But, who's to say finance in a consumer products company and finance in an energy company? It just depends on what makes you tick and what makes you happy, because finance is finance. Well, a finance person may tell me otherwise.
And connected to that, our last speaker, as we were talking about earlier, was Tim Roush. He's the Chief Nuclear Officer for Talon Energy.
So he and I would have nothing in common.
Except, the last question I'm going to ask you is, what's the next question? And the last question I asked of him was the same thing. And I said, hey, our next speaker is Barbara Heim. She's a HR director for BG Group, oil and gas company. And what should I ask her? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, look, this is a challenge for us in the nuclear industry, and I know it's also got to be a challenge in the oil and gas industry. We have a new generation we have an old generation of people retiring, right? Whatever the statistics are, it's every industry is facing the same thing. There's a whole lot of baby boomers retiring, and a lot of gaps to fill.
Yes.
And of course, we got young people about to graduate from college, and they want a career somewhere, somehow. They want to not live in their parents' basements for more than the next 10 years or so. I thought I'd get a bigger laugh for that one.
Depends how nice the basement is.
Wouldn't want to live in my basement, Madison, Tyler. But he said, we're really fit. How do we attract this generation? Ask her, how do we go about attracting this next generation to be interested in these fields and these jobs, and to stick around, to use your language?
Yeah, so I get it, because that's a very real problem, because there's this huge mid-career gap. And fortunately, the oil price dropped, so you didn't need as many people, so that sort of, but and this is what happened, right? So in the 80s, they did such big layoffs that all these people didn't go into the field, and it became a huge problem. I think what we're doing has been actually addressing that problem the last couple of years, is we're going in and trying to entice 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds about the benefits. I mean, as I told you, where I grew up, I mean, it was IBM. You wore a blue suit with a white shirt and a red tie. I mean, that's what everybody's father worked for.
Company man.
Yeah, that's right. Or you got on the train and you went to New York City. You didn't work for an oil and gas company. And I think part of our challenge is, and now, especially, you look at who knew Marcellus Shale, right? I mean, the people around Williamsport didn't realize what an economic boon the oil and gas industry could be. So I think we have to do a better job of going broader about the education, because typically we're just going in our backyards. So Houston, Rio, oh my gosh, we have spent tons of money, the whole industry has, because you want to develop homegrown talent, and Brazil didn't have any oil and gas until the discoveries, 10 years ago. So we're really pushing about what it is like. And it's interesting, because I think you have to provide some kind of incentive and bait to people, explaining why energy is sexy, right? What's the hook? And I think the fact that all these kids, use technology, right? How do they think this technology works? You have to explain to them that the reason their phone is so cool is because you can plug it into the wall. Where does that come from? And I think that's what we have to do is get them to equate it more to how it works. Because I think we're just too naive and we don't, it's not as flashy. But I also think explaining to them about all the opportunities, because the other thing about working in these large companies is the breadth. You could start, and there's lots of, God forbid, there's actually engineers who have moved into human resources. Hey, they do it. People move, they move into, I've taken people from finance and moved them into HR. I've taken engineers and moved them to HR, and some of them I moved back. But you have so much opportunities, and I think it's about explaining that to people and getting the message out. We don't. Energy companies don't do a very good job of branding what it's like, or I should say, they did not do a very good job of branding what it's like. I was remarking, I don't know are they showing the ExxonMobil commercials up here? I think they're fantastic, and you had mentioned Anadarko had done it, but they are humanizing it. Bob, my name is Bob, I'm a driller. Susie, I'm and they start saying, this is who I am. And you can just hear, and of course they're all actors, but it sounds like the pride that they have for working for this company. And I think that's what's important, is to help people understand. I know people in Houston that all they want to do is work for Shell. And when we got bought by Shell, which is how I cha-chinged and got out and retired. But we had dinner with the CEO of Shell. So our executive team met with the CEO and the CFO. And the CEO started telling us that, he grew up in The Hague, which is where the Royal Dutch Shell is headquartered. And he grew up right there. As a small boy, he always wanted to work for Shell. And I had this vision all of a sudden of his parents gave him a onesie with the big Shell pectin on it, And I thought, at first, okay, that's just, but you could just hear, he really meant it. That's all he wanted to do was work for Shell. And I think if you live in one of these communities, they take care of their people, right? They have great jobs, they go live around the world, they do all these kinds of things, and I think that's good. But if somebody's growing up in Pleasantville, New York, you didn't understand what that was. Or my nephew who's at Georgia Tech, I tried to get him to go into petroleum engineering. He goes, why would I do that? And I did I even brought him to BG for the career day and he goes, yeah, hey, Barbara, I'm not doing that. He wants to be an electrical engineer. Okay, good for you. But because I don't think I tried as hard as I could to help him understand what's in there, but I think a lot of them, they just don't understand all the availability of variety that you can get in oil and gas.
And a couple of the thoughts as you were talking about the variety in various ways that made me think of is the largest employer of environmental scientists, right, in the world are energy companies. Right. And then the other one is, I was talking with the regional director here of Energy Transfer Partners, which is a pipeline company. Not without its controversy, so the conversation was about whether or not there could be internship opportunities between Lycoming College and the company. And he said, oh yeah, that would be great. Well, what majors would you be interested in bringing an intern? Well, anything. We have a poli-sci major who's going to do government relations. We'll put them in the field during their internship. Mm-hmm. We get an accounting major who's going to be in accounting. We'll put them in the field during the internship. Right. They need to understand the business. Right. And then they can do a better job at being our accountant or our PR person or our communications person or whatever. So
it's exactly what we did. We had a world-class graduate program. And it was very, very competitive. In our graduate program, the reason people came to us as opposed to going to Shell and Exxon was because we guaranteed they would do 4 different jobs in a 2-year program, and at least one of them was overseas, was international. Whereas a lot of the other companies say you may or may not do it, and these kids really wanted to do an international. But so if they came in finance, they may do a trading job. They may do, but we put them out in the field. They all had to there were lots of different aspects to the program. So you had a job, but you also had technical training that you had to learn. And so because we wanted to teach them about the business, we needed them to be savvy about what, just because you were going to work in human resources, you had to understand what it takes to run a gas plant, or what it takes to run an oil rig, so that we had them. We had to get, helicopter certified, so you go offshore and do those kinds of things. And people have to know the business that they're in, be able to talk.
Yeah. Before I turn it over, the last question I have for you then is, well, first, this is our last event of the Spring Symposium. So, sorry, I'm a slacker. I haven't gotten around to organizing the events for the fall. So I don't know, I can't tell you who the first speaker in the fall will be. But what should I ask that person?
Why didn't they speak in the spring? Sorry.
For the benefit of the audience, who will be there?
I would probably ask something along the theme of, what else can we do to change public perception about the industry? Because it really gets a lot of backlash. I mean, there's a lot of negativity.
Okay.
And I remember when that movie Gasland came out. I mean, we were all absolutely horrified. And you start thinking about it, but what did we do to try to change it before that movie came out? Because we knew that there was so much falsehood in that movie, but I think when you're chasing after the fact, you're already behind. So it's around what can they do more to talk about and it's not about tooting your horn, but I think we have to do a much better job of changing perception about what it is they're doing. So what else can they do to change that perception to make it more positive?
Thank you. Now I open it up to the audience. What do we want to know more about? Are you going to be able to
ask anything? I told you at dinner everything.
Micah,
we were talking. Oh.
for the, I probably shouldn't throw it.
I think it's so my question is, we were talking about trends in employment, and one of the things that I've heard is that employment in coal is falling, partially because we're not using as much coal, but partially because how we extract the coal is much more efficient and less labor intensive. Is the same trend happening in oil and gas, and why?
Yes, because technology, well, a couple of reasons. Sometimes safety drives it, so it's not just cost, but it's also that you need less people because you have more robotics that are doing a lot of the activities. And I would say there's still, so certain jobs are less, but there's always other jobs though that then come in. So for example, the more oil and gas there is, the more traders that you need. So the more pipelines that are built, the more traders that you need, the more storage facilities you need. So what happens is the labor just shifts. So you're not, maybe we don't need as many people to produce, but we need people on the other side. So I just think it's about identifying where the skills are going to be needed and then start retraining those people to be able to do those other jobs.
Do you need me to walk the stairs Donahue style, or okay? There's like 3 people in the room who know what I mean when I say Donahue.
You're dating yourself.
So on the one hand, you talked about corporate social responsibility.
Yes.
And then on the other, there's always sort of this tension with a profit, right? Like companies' responsibilities to maximize profit for their investors.
Yep.
And despite the fact that you want to be as good as possible, you also have to make sure that you're paying your investors enough.
Yep.
And so then you also mentioned this piece where you're trying to cultivate local labor forces.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is, in HR, there's this, sort of opportunity to engage in what we call the race to the bottom to pay the lowest amount that you can for local labor forces, to not have to adhere to local labor laws because they don't exist. So how does that work when you're in HR in a company that's owned and headquartered in a developed country but operating in places that have different constraints?
So we had standards. Remember all those books and standards? And you couldn't violate labor laws. But part of what we would do, so I guess my best example is like Brazil, right? Brazil didn't have the labor force we needed, so we shipped them in from everywhere else and then would go side by side to train them. Interestingly, it cost us more to hire a Brazilian employee than it did to pay for an expat, and that's because of Brazil labor laws. But you're paying what you need to pay in the market. Okay, so you're not looking, it's not about being cheap. You're looking, because remember, it's very competitive. And for some reason, everybody goes into these countries together, which, like we were in Australia. ConocoPhillips was building, literally on Curtis Island, you see 3 LNG plants right next to each other. And the war for talent was amazing. And as soon as ConocoPhillips gave everybody a raise, we had to go give a raise. It was quite frustrating, actually. But you couldn't go communicate with them and say, don't give your people a raise so we won't get, that's against the law, right? So we weren't going to do those kind. So it's really about identifying what the local competition, the talent is. But most importantly, the first thing you're doing is trying to train them. Most of the countries that when we would go in, we had to get agreements around how many visas we could have. And typically they would limit the amount of visas because the purpose of you doing business in there was to get local employment. So we would, if we needed, say to go over our number, we would have to sit down with the labor department and say, okay, here's the issue. We need another 2 years of bringing these people in so they can train these people. But for certain jobs, like it was really hard to get HR, finance, any of the support functions, because they'd say, well, our people know how to do it. But what we also did quite a bit is we moved people out of Tanzania and we shipped them to the UK, and they spent a couple years there, or Brazil. So we also exported talent for a couple years to then bring it back into the country. So I would argue that they're not, look, there are always bad companies out there, and I'm not saying we were perfect, but we really were above the, we tried to do better than the average. We wanted to be above average because we wanted to be in that country for a long time and wanted to leave a good mark. So I think there are companies out there that are terrible and that would try to do that, but not if you're going to be around a long time, because you're going to create too many problems if you're mistreating folks and not doing the right thing.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Absolutely.
Did you see a lot of variance across regions? So were Latin American countries more likely to be a little bit more restrictive in how many visas they would give you as opposed to like African countries, or was that pretty uniform?
I would say it was harder for us to get visas in Africa than it was in Latin America. And part of it was we had the other challenges in Africa were the bribery and fraud, and it was horrible. And we would see this, the government taking money for themselves. And that's what was so frustrating. And you'd say, because we were trying to get visas so that we could help the little people, and they wanted more money for themselves, and that's why they were so strict on visas. It was very weird, but yeah. And Australia was part of the easiest, because Australia knew that the only way they were going to get these built is if they loosened up their visa protocols. So America's actually one of the hardest.
More questions?
Hello.
Hi.
Is this on?
That's a dangerous sounding question.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about millennials and our uses of technology, and I'm the first to agree with that statement. Have you seen the industry change their recruitment strategies towards maybe targeting our generation? I think that could be a potential way to reach out, and like you had mentioned, how to change the dialogue about the industry. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So what I found most challenging with millennials coming in was they're managed very differently. So millennials were much more into work-life balance, where the old regime was, you stay until the lights are off kind of thing. It was the millennials like, yeah, we're not doing this. This is a lot. The other thing is millennials think that they should be CEO tomorrow. And it was around managing their expectation of the experiences that they needed that would better prepare them to move up. So that's once they're hired. Hiring them, it was, again, they all wanted to know what the story was. So the recruitment took a different tact, that we had to tell the whole story around what they could do, so all the possibilities that they could have. So we had to spend actually more time, whereas 10 years ago, you could just say, do you want an engineering job at BG here? You didn't have to sell them as much. You had to do much more selling, and it's probably a bad choice of words, so I apologize ahead of time, coddling with the millennials to recruit them in. But I think the part that we're missing, though, is the before they're graduates, right? So I think we've got to get to them in middle school, really, and start talking about what the possibilities of to get that hook. Because I think if we wait until college, it's too late. That's my opinion.
Anyone else?
Okay.
Join me in thanking Mrs. Heim for her time and energies.
Thank you all for coming.
And that brings our symposium to close for the semester. Join us next fall, where our working topic, I think, is going to be a look at Marcellus Shale and unconventional natural gas development, kind of 10 years retrospective and 10 years prospective, because we're about 10 years into it in this region of the country, and really outside the traditional areas of the country where oil and gas is developed. The timing's about the same, whether you're talking about the oil of North Dakota or the natural gas of the Marcellus and Utica regions. We're about 10 years in, so I think it should be an interesting topic.